I never used to believe in anything I could not see with my own eyes, but living in this old house for the last few years has completely changed my perspective on the world. My name is Sam, and I moved into this drafty two-story farmhouse tucked away in a dense forest after my uncle passed away from a long illness about 5 years ago. He had lived there alone for decades, and the place always felt a bit heavy with his presence, even before the stranger things started happening during the first winter. It was a quiet transition at first, with just the normal creaks and groans you would expect from floorboards that had seen nearly a century of heavy snow and summer heat. I spent most of my evenings sitting in his old leather armchair, reading by the fireplace and trying to make the space feel like it actually belonged to me now. The isolation of the woods was peaceful at first, but as the shadows grew longer in the evenings, I began to feel like I was being watched by something unseen. The atmosphere in the house took a noticeably darker turn after I lost my companion, a sleek ginger cat that had been my only roommate since the day I moved into the property. He had been a gift from my uncle years prior, and losing him to a sudden coyote attack in the woods behind the garden felt like the final thread connecting me to the past. After he was gone, the silence in the house became almost deafening, and I started noticing small, inexplicable changes in the rooms where he used to spend most of his time. I would find his old favorite toys moved from the corners of the kitchen to the center of the hallway, despite the fact that I lived entirely alone and never touched them. It felt like a lingering energy was trying to remind me that the house was not as empty as it appeared to be during the long, lonely nights of the winter. I tried to tell myself it was just grief playing tricks on my mind, but the physical sensations that followed were far too real to be ignored by any rational person. One evening, while I was drifting off to sleep in the master bedroom upstairs, I felt a sharp, distinct pressure against my shoulder that felt exactly like a firm hand trying to wake me. I bolted upright, my heart hammering against my ribs, and fumbled for the lamp on the bedside table to see who could possibly be standing in my locked and bolted house. In the dim yellow light, I caught a glimpse of a tall, broad-shouldered figure standing near the wooden wardrobe, wearing a faded flannel shirt and dark work trousers. Before I could even find my voice to speak or demand an explanation, the figure seemed to dissolve into the shadows of the corner, leaving behind nothing but a lingering scent of tobacco. I sat there for hours, staring at the empty space and trying to convince myself that my exhausted mind was simply creating images out of the darkness and the heavy silence. I eventually fell back into a restless sleep, but the image of that man stayed burned into the back of my eyelids for the rest of the night. A few weeks after that unsettling incident, I was out in the yard late one evening, trying to clear away some of the fallen branches that the wind had scattered across the driveway. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a familiar flash of orange fur darting between the thick trunks of the oak trees that lined the edge of the property. Thinking my cat had somehow miraculously survived and returned home, I dropped my rake and started calling out to him with a desperate sense of hope rising in my chest. I chased the movement toward the old barn, watching as the small shape paused near the heavy wooden doors and looked back at me with eyes that seemed to reflect the moon. Just as I reached out to scoop the animal up, the shape flickered like a dying candle flame and vanished completely, leaving me standing alone in the freezing night air. I walked back to the house in a daze, wondering if I was finally losing my grip on reality. When I retreated back into the warmth of the house, feeling shaken and confused, I decided to distract myself by watching some television in the living room to drown out the silence. As I sat on the sofa, I suddenly felt the undeniable sensation of something soft and furry brushing slowly against my ankles, moving with the rhythmic grace of a small pet. I froze in place, looking down at my feet and expecting to see a physical animal there, but the space between my legs and the coffee table was entirely vacant. The feeling was so vivid and warm that I could almost hear the faint, vibrating sound of a purr echoing against the floorboards beneath my heavy wool socks in the quiet room. It was at that moment that I realized the house was holding onto the memories of those who had passed away within its thick, insulated walls and ancient wooden frames. I tried to find comfort in the sensation, thinking it was just a friendly visit, but the sightings were starting to become more frequent and bold. The most terrifying experience of that month occurred during the middle of a bright, sunny afternoon, while I was busy folding laundry in the dining room that overlooked the side garden. I happened to glance toward the large bay window and saw a man walking slowly past the glass, his head turned slightly as if he were inspecting the state of the garden. He looked exactly like the figure I had seen in my bedroom, and the sunlight caught the worn texture of his flannel shirt and the silver glint of his hair. I dropped the basket and sprinted to the back door, bursting out onto the porch and shouting for the intruder to stop so I could finally see his face clearly. The yard was completely open and offered nowhere to hide, yet the man had disappeared into thin air in the few seconds it took me to reach the spot. I stood there in the sun, shivering as I realized that whatever was sharing this house with me was becoming a permanent part of my daily life. As the weeks turned into months, the presence in the house shifted from a flickering shadow into something that felt far more solid and heavy. I started waking up at the exact same time every single night, feeling a sudden drop in the room's temperature that made my breath visible. It wasn't just the cold that bothered me, but the sense that the air itself was thick with an unspoken message from someone I missed. I would sit up in bed, straining my ears for a sound that I knew wouldn't come from a living soul in this remote forest. Every creak of the floorboards began to sound like a deliberate footstep, moving from the hallway toward the door of my bedroom with a steady rhythm. The isolation of the countryside made every tiny noise feel like a thunderclap, and I found myself talking to the empty air just to cope. One afternoon, I decided to finally clear out the dusty attic space where my uncle had stored most of his old journals and heavy wooden crates. As I climbed the narrow, rickety ladder, a sudden gust of wind slammed the small window shut, even though there was no breeze outside. I felt a familiar, sharp tug on the hem of my jeans, exactly like the way my cat used to signal that he wanted attention. When I looked down, there was nothing but the swirling dust motes dancing in the narrow beams of light that filtered through the roof. I stood there for a long time, paralyzed by the feeling of being surrounded by the invisible remnants of a life that had ended. It felt as though the house was a living record of every footstep and every breath that had ever been taken within its walls. One evening, while I was preparing a simple dinner in the kitchen, I saw his reflection clearly in the darkened glass of the oven door. He was standing right behind me, his hand raised as if he were about to reach out and place it on my weary shoulder. I didn't turn around this time, fearing that the movement would cause the image to shatter like glass and leave me alone again. Instead, I simply acknowledged his presence with a quiet nod, feeling a strange sense of peace wash over me despite the illogical situation. The scent of old tobacco and wood smoke filled the small room, lingering long after the reflection had faded back into the dark. Late one night, a heavy thunderstorm rolled through the valley, shaking the foundations of the house and sending flashes of lightning across the fields. During a particularly bright flash, I saw the ginger cat sitting perfectly still on the rug in the center of the living room. He looked as real and vibrant as the day he was born, his green eyes glowing with an intelligent light as they met mine. I reached out a trembling hand, hoping to feel the warmth of his fur one last time before the darkness returned to the room. As the thunder crashed overhead, the image of the cat didn't vanish immediately, but slowly dissolved into a pile of autumn leaves that hadn't been there. I realized then that the bond we shared was stronger than the veil between the living and the dead, manifesting in ways I couldn't understand. I began to notice that the man would often appear near the old oak tree where he used to sit and watch the sunset. One evening, I walked out to the spot and found a small, rusted metal box buried just beneath the surface of the soft, damp earth. Inside were old photographs of the house from a time when the forest was younger and the paint on the walls was fresh. I felt a sudden warmth on the back of my neck, a sensation of approval that radiated from the empty air behind me. It was as if my uncle was guiding me to these small pieces of history, ensuring that his legacy wouldn't be forgotten by the new owner. I brought the box back inside and placed it on the mantelpiece, right next to the photograph of my cat that I kept there. Living in this house has taught me that death is not the final ending I once believed it to be in my youth. As I sit by the fire tonight, I know that I am never truly alone in the heart of these ancient, whispering woods.